Look, I think the two things that come to mind. Number one, I actually think the European front is going to be something that would be of consequence if Russia, God forbid, advances and really puts Ukraine on its back. That would be a very destabilizing moment. It actually could benefit. I mean, it could go either way. Actually, I could see it hurting Biden for the reasons I said. You're the guy in charge, and if this happens under your watch, you're probably going to get blamed. But Trump's anti-Ukraine rhetoric could also hurt him. I certainly think that could hurt him if he becomes president and he ends up. If he doesn't give Ukraine the support it needs and bad things happen, Trump could really, if he's president, could really suffer the political consequences in that scenario. But, in the middle of a campaign, if that happened, I think it could have a lot of significant effects. It's hard to say. I think it would probably hurt Biden more, but it's up I think it's up for grabs. Health is the other wild card. If God forbid, Biden had a severe health issue, couldn't run. Trump as well. They're both, it's hard to believe. You have an 81-year-old and a 77-year-old, by far the two oldest nominees ever to run for president, or ever to be nominees of their parties. That is something that I think is, it's definitely something we've not really dealt with, and it's possible you could have a health issue that could really, really shake things up. You have like two 80-something-year-old candidates that are deeply, deeply disliked. Look, that would take a whole nother speech, but let me give you throw out a few things. Number one, negative polarization, which you may have heard that term, but it basically means you don't support a candidate. You hate the other side. That's your political identity is not in who the nominee is. It's who the other guy is. So, most Democrats, you see this in polls, they don't love Biden, but they're going to vote for him because they hate Trump, right? And vice versa. So that dynamic, along with the familiarity that, tends to benefit if you're an incumbent or you're a familiar face, those two things have kind of helped seal the rematch in place. I also think, social media, it's sort of a paradox. We're in very destabilizing political times, but, being a name, being a brand kind of benefit. I mean, it takes a lot of work if you're Nikki Haley or you assume that people know who these people are. It takes a lot of effort to get the name identification to the point where you can really raise the money and mount a serious campaign. So I don't think that's the only reason why Trump won so easily and Biden didn't face any credible challenge. But I think that also is a factor. I'd also add internationally, like the one thing, I mean, this is less to do with Biden and Trump and more to do with sort of the rise of extremes on both sides. But this is not an American phenomenon at all. I mean, you see this in England, you see this in South America. Obviously, Brazil just lurched from right to left on the far, there's a history of that, I think, more in South America, not so much in Europe. But you look at the communist and the very fascist right-wing vote in France. That's much bigger than I think people realize. Germany is dealing with AfD. I mean, there's a lot of this is an international phenomenon. It's not just an American phenomenon, and I think people forget that. I think it has a lot to do with how people get their news, how people consume information. We're in the middle of an information revolution. AI is, killing the jobs of reporters and people who actually try to be dispassionate and get facts to everyone. And we're now in a era where 40% of people aged 18 to 29 are getting their news on TikTok, which is owned by the Chinese Communist Party. That's crazy. I mean, it's kind of insane, right? I mean, that the notion that you would have like a major news or that's my parent, I have a sort of a legacy of my dad and my grandfather working for the Federal Communications Commission. My grandfather was involved in a lot of the big regulation cases where, ownership of different TV stations or newspapers. The notion that you would have, a major news source, potential news source, being owned by like the Soviets that would be unthinkable. And we've allowed that to happen because we're too afraid to say, hey, this is unacceptable. And it's now the toothpaste is well out of the tube. Democrats have an advantage in that they do have like the first tranche of 100%. I'm voting no matter what, come hell or high water. That is an advantage Democrats have. They have, in fact, I think one reason you don't hear a lot about voter suppression anymore. I think it's not to be sort of cynical about it, but I think it's because Democrats now realize that lower turnout actually helps them, not hurts them, at least among like a lot of the less likely to vote voters. I think the challenge, though, is going to be with young voters. I mean, that goes to your second question. Trump, you're right. Like, I think Trump's big challenge is to make sure that people who are, I really am disillusioned with this whole process. I tend to maybe agree with Trump more, but he's just too crazy. He's in trial. Like, I'm not going to show up. I'm just, voting or maybe even voting Kennedy. But Biden has to deal with the campus kids, and he has to deal with what really is the young progressives, which is also a pretty sizable, not a huge chunk, but it's also that same chunk of the Democratic coalition that was a big vote, high turnout in 2016 and 2020. So again, like I try to I have the same reaction you do. I have that same, when I'm looking at, and then it's like, oh yeah, there's the other side of the coin. With each side has to deal with their disillusioned voters. Each side has to deal with the gender gap is at historic levels. By the way, like abortion is a winning issue, and that it's Democrats' best issue. But the risk for not a risk, but the reminder they need to remind themselves is not to forget about the other issues and make sure they have a holistic argument to the voters.